All right, so Joe Rogan is known to have trouble understanding jokes sometimes. That's been well documented, and some of his comedian friends have even talked about it quite a bit. But a great example of this that people don't really mention too much is the time Norm Macdonald trolled him. And he did it so well, still to this day, Joe doesn't realize it was just a bit, and Norm was trying to mess with him. And Joe tells this story all the time. I mean, he loves telling it because he loves Norm. Like, Norm might be the number one person or comedian, at least, that Joe wishes he could have had on his podcast. And I'm sure Joe tried to make it happen plenty of times. But Norm isn't the easiest guest to get on your show. And also, I don't think Norm was the biggest fan of Joe's. I don't think he disliked him or anything, but it's clear he didn't really think he was the best comedian. I mean, there are only a handful of times Norm ever mentioned Joe, and when he did, he was just kind of goofing on him and the Death Squad. Like, he talked about it with Bobby Lee on his show, and he was just laughing about how Rogan and his posse of comedians used to call themselves the Death Squad.
Are you part of the Death Squad? Okay.
But I have had problems with them.
Yeah.
They tried to derail me years ago. Well, because I was in cahoots with Mencia, they thought.
Okay.
Oh, right.
So when the whole Carlos Mencia, Joe Rogan thing happened, they had me on tape. Apologize, that's what I said back then.
Do you mean he put this up on the internet or
then
something?
He put it on the internet, Death Squad did,
shoot.
right? And all of a sudden now, right?
You opened for Mencia, which made you the enemy of the Death Squad.
Yeah. Because,
It's like a Bruce Lee movie.
Yeah, it's just like it.
So the Death Squad.
I don't know what Bruce Lee movie.
They're comedians?
Yeah.
Well, don't you think Death Squad makes more sense in a Bruce Lee movie than a comedy club?
That's true.
I went to a comedy club, and then the next week, the Death Squad were there. It's just odd. I don't know. And they acted like it was a normal thing. And I said, it's here next week. I said, the Death Squad.
Sorry, blood and oxygen pass the blood-brain barrier, so you won't get Alzheimer's.
Joe Rogan didn't give you this by any chance.
Yeah, so it definitely seems like Norm didn't find Joe very funny, but he did find it funny to goof on him. Like, the only other time I could find where Norm mentioned him at all is when he's talking about how Joe is a drug advocate.
We were talking in the break about salvia and drug advocates like Joe Rogan that are actual advocates of drugs, which they didn't used to be,
Well, you just mentioned Timothy Leary earlier.
Well, yes, there were academics and there were intellectuals, but I'm just talking about nightclub comics. but I was just wondering about Mark's experience.
And it sounds like Norm didn't really like when comedians would start to stray away from just doing comedy and get more into philosophy and that kind of stuff.
I've read one place that said the comedian is the modern day philosopher. And first thing I thought is, I wonder how the actual modern day philosophers feel about it.
So Norm would probably hate the comedy landscape now, but he probably just find it funny. It'd been great to see him goof on some of these guys. Like, it's too bad we never got to see him on Rogan's podcast, because I'm sure he would have made some jokes about Joe and they would have gone over his head. Like, just seeing Joe try to understand some of the jokes Norm would be making would have been great. I mean, still to this day, Joe doesn't realize that Norm was doing a bit one of the times they met each other, and I believe is over 15 years ago, maybe. And Joe still tells this story like, oh no, he's being 100% serious. Like, apparently Joe had a conversation with Norm on a plane that either was Norm doing a bit or it caused Norm to relapse on cigarettes. So apparently Rogan, he was randomly seated next to Norm 2 different times on flights. And the second time, Norm spent most of the flight talking to Rogan about how he quit cigarettes. But then when they landed, right away, Norm bought a pack and started smoking them. And it was like, man, all that talk about cigarettes made me want to smoke, which definitely sounds like Norm's sense of humor. And Rogan's obviously the perfect person to do this bit on because he's going to completely believe it. I mean, it would have been great seeing his reaction when they got back and Norm lit up a cigarette. I mean, it sounded like he's just in shock. Like, what are you doing? I thought you quit smoking. What's going on? And still, he acts like he saw Norm relapse on cigarettes, even though some comedians have kind of tried to explain it to him. But you tell they also don't really want to burst Joe's bubble because he loves this story. He loves telling it. I mean, he's probably told it over 20 times on his podcast, and still whenever he brings it up, he acts like it's the first time anybody's heard it. So he brought this up to Colin Quinn when he was on there, and Colin was much closer to Norm. Like, he was actually friends with him, so he would know. And it sounds like he's heard Norm do this bit before. But like I said, I don't think he really wants to burst Joe's bubble, so he kind of just politely tries to explain it to him. And it's funny because before Joe brings this up, they're talking about how Norm was like the ultimate troll, but then still Joe goes on to tell the story like he was being 100% serious.
As a double troll.
Yeah.
No, Norm is capable of the double troll. It's like,
The double troll, exactly.
yes, he's the master of that stuff.
I randomly wound up sitting next to him on planes twice. On 2 different occasions, just like I go, Norm, like out of nowhere, and he's sitting next to me. And one time, we're sitting there, we're talking, we're having a good old time, and then he's talking about, I quit smoking. He's telling me how he quit smoking and finally quit smoking. And he's telling me all these things. And then when he lands, he literally like he can't stop himself, runs into the airport store and buys cigarettes. And he's lighting it as he's leaving. I go, I thought you quit. He goes, I did. But all that talking about smoking makes me want one. And he's like, before he even got out the door, he's lighting the cigarette. He just couldn't stop himself.
But I like that he goes, all that talking. He's the one talking about it. All that talking. He always puts it on you. That's what's great about it.
But
he's like, this guy talks about smoking. He got me back smoking.
But it was so crazy because I was like, that's great, Norm. It's so great you quit. And he's like, fuck, I want a cigarette.
Yeah. No, he always do like, yeah, I mean, I don't drink, I quit drinking. And it was like, oh, really? Did you drink a lot? Yeah. I quit. I finally had to quit, It's hard, but I did it. And they're like, oh. He goes, yeah, because I got fucking wasted last night. And I said, I'm never going to drink again. I was drunk. And people are like, wait, I thought you quit. Yeah, I quit. That's what I'm saying. He's always...
Last night?
Yeah. It's like an elaborate, like Abbott and Costello routine.
Yes, exactly.
But this just makes the bit so much better. The fact that still after all these years, Joe actually believes Norm quit smoking and he saw him relapse after the conversation they had. And Joe also brought this up to Tom Green, and his response was like, yeah, knowing Norm is probably all an elaborate setup.
Lighting them before he gets out the door.
Yeah.
And I go, I thought you quit. He goes, I did. But all that talking about it made me want to smoke.
Yeah, it's probably all an elaborate setup, right? He probably was planning it the whole way.
I don't know.
Who knows?
So it would have been great seeing them do a podcast together. And I saw somebody did ask Norm during an AMA he was doing on Reddit if he had ever gone on Joe's podcast. And even his answer just seems like he's trolling. They're like, do you have any plans of doing Joe's podcast? I would love to see you on there. He just said, I will do that. And then I also saw this interaction that Norm had with Joe on Twitter back in 2016. And again, it seems like Norm could be just trying to mess with Joe because I guess Tony Hinchcliffe on his Netflix special, he had a joke that had a similar premise to one of Norm's. And Norm probably heard it was one of Rogan's friends, like somebody part of the Death Squad, which he probably thought was hilarious. So he tweeted at Joe and just said, Joe, someone tells me a man stole a joke from me and put it on his Netflix special, says he's a friend of yours. Can you vouch for him? And it's just hilarious that he went to Rogan with this, and he doesn't even mention Tony's name at all. Like, he just calls him a man. He doesn't even refer to him as a comedian either. And Joe responded and said, Norm, Tony Hinchcliffe's joke is completely different. They're just about the same subject. He's not a thief. So it definitely seems like Norm just enjoyed trying to mess with Joe. And there were rumors of him possibly going on Joe's podcast, I think around like 2018, 2019. And I think Joe mentioned like they're texting back and forth, but Norm was in some controversy because he defended Louis C.K. and he made some joke on the Howard Stern show or something. And I think at the time he had like a Netflix deal and he claimed Netflix just didn't want him to go on Joe's podcast, which again could be him just trying to mess with Joe, like using it as an opportunity to be like, oh, I would go on there, but right now they don't want me to. But also, even after that, Norm was planning on bringing back his live show. And Adam Egget, who's the co-host and now actually the booker for the Mothership, he was on Joe's podcast and he said that Norm wanted Joe on as the first guest for the show. And it sounded like it was serious, like they're scheduling things, and obviously Joe sounded really excited about it, but unfortunately it never happened.
To put all the nuts and bolts into place, and then get a studio, get a camera, and just do it. But you're going to be the first guest.
I'm in.
All right, good.
So just tell me when, so I can plan ahead.
We're shooting the first one in the fall. So
okay. So you're gonna plan it out. You're gonna map it out in advance.
I can't wait, and we're still,
I'm in. Listen, I love Norm to pieces. He's one of my all-time favorite human beings.
Same here.
That have ever lived. I have a great story about Norm. Me and him on a plane, And randomly, this is crazy but true, randomly, twice I sat next to him on planes.
Yeah, and right on cue, Joe goes into that story, but then he starts talking about how amazing Norm's podcast would be.
I can't wait to come back with this podcast.
Norm is the hidden king of the internet. If he decided to have a podcast, it would be the biggest podcast of all time. If he just did it on a regular basis.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. I mean, that podcast would have been great, especially seeing Rogan on there or any of his comedian friends, like seeing Norm interact with them. But unfortunately, we never got a podcast with Joe and Norm, which I'm sure Joe is really disappointed about. But at least he always has this plane story I'm sure he's never going to stop telling. So that's about it for this video. If you guys want more content from me, if you want to hear about what happened to the Death Squad, like why they stopped using that name and how they kind of got in an argument about it, make sure you check out my Patreon account. I made a whole video about that. And I also have a video about the fight between Bill Burr and Brian Redband that happened on Joe's podcast. That was really entertaining. And there's just a ton of other stuff on Patreon. I have over 80 videos. There's a lot to go through. So if you're a fan of the channel, you want to help support it, make sure you check it out. I'll put a link in the description.